meeting even as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to remain the dominant context. I've been asked to share my thoughts about turning the geopolitical crisis into an opportunity. And so let me begin by stating that I'm glad that the term used is geopolitical rather than just the pandemic, for among the important realizations that we must address is the fact that many of the key stresses that will shape the world predate the pandemic and in some senses are really structural. So if I could say this, pre-existing issues and comorbidities are apparently as relevant in international relations as they are in public health. Now, it is customary on such occasions to start by emphasizing how much we are missing the good old times and hoping for a return to the real rather than the virtual life. Now, I will not do that. I will not do that, not because I'm a contrarian, but to emphasize that importance of adapting to change rather than resisting it. We are in the midst of the most catastrophic global event since the Second World War. And one of its consequences will be that those living in extreme poverty will increase for the first time in a quarter century. But there are other results as well, among them how countries perceive national security and global trade so much more differently than before. The additional stresses on the global system will surely aggravate its already difficult predicament. We may be interacting today in a hybrid mode, but in many ways do so in a hybrid world. The old, the emerging, and the over the horizon coexist, and it's reading them right to draw policy conclusions that are really going to be the challenges that we will all face. Now, bear in mind that we are far from a static landscape, and each of these multiple realities that I refer to are also in transition. So revisiting assumptions is therefore just as important as reviewing strategy, and put simply, a difficult world has become even more complicated. Now that brings me to the geopolitical issue. At the heart of the changes in current world politics is a fundamental rebalancing of the international system. More countries count today than they did before, and naturally we have moved from the G7 to the G20. But we also need to assign different weightages to different players, not just the United States and China, but others, including India. And the metrics of measuring power is now very different. It's not merely military, but finance, trade, connectivity, data, technology, and as we have discovered recently, even masks and ventilators. In my business, we call it multipolarity, which means more players relevant to outcomes. And that obviously calls for a very different architecture from the times when there were two camps led by the US and USSR, or just the dominance of the United States. It means not just doing diplomacy differently on a one-to-one or collective basis, but also forming working arrangements with those who have converging interests. A particular challenge for the international community is to come to terms with the sharper contradictions between the United States and China, and the consequent operational difficulties in the absence of common ground. The short point again here is that both the landscape and the nature of global politics were already changing before the pandemic. What the COVID-19 did was to contribute additional layers of complexity in a range of dimensions. Now, why would we look at the world differently today than we would say on January 1st? To begin with, because of a greater distrust of the merits of globalization as it is currently defined. And the last part of this phrasing, as it is currently defined, is particularly important. We have already seen domestic debates on social and economic costs of globalization translate into political outcomes across the world. In the course of the last few years, it also morphed into concerns about global shifts of power and influence. Now, what COVID-19 has gone and done is to give us a much more existential meaning through health security, trade security, and job security. The second factor is a better awareness of what globalization is really about. We traditionally tend to think of trade, finance, and mobility, but it is equally about the more indivisible challenges of climate change, pandemics, and terrorism. We cannot be in denial of interdependence, but we can certainly argue about its degree and terms, its benefits and risks. And that is taking the shape, amongst others, of conversations about resilient supply chains. If the world needs more trusted and capable players, India needs to primarily focus on the latter attribute, since it is well regarded on the former score. As a pluralistic and open society with a market economy, it is systemically in sync with the rest of the world. Even during the pandemic, it ramped up its pharmaceutical production, especially of hydroxychloroquine and paracetamol, to respond to growing global demands. In fact, we supplied medicines to more than 150 countries, about half of them on a grant basis. Our medical teams were deployed in 4 of our neighbors who were in distress. But as we learned during this period, the challenges were much more of capabilities. At the beginning of the pandemic, in fact, India did not make PPEs, testing kits, or ventilators, and had a very basic capacity when it came to masks. Today, we have not just a sizable industry in this respect, but a growing record of exports as well. The lesson from that is of an India with greater capabilities, not just helping itself, but being a force of good in international relations. And that is why the outlook of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, is important for the world. This is not about protectionism. It is about building greater strengths at home to play more effectively abroad. We are today in the midst of making multiple choices. It would be relatively easy for us to just focus on recovery. In many ways, getting back to where we were before is a very natural human trait. But in this crisis, we have ambitiously taken the road of opportunity. Those of you who follow developments in India would have noted a spate of major reforms recently in the domains of labor, agriculture, and education, amongst others. They parallel a sustained focus on making it easier to do business. If there is one major takeaway from the current pandemic, it is the enormous power of the digital. This has been visible in activities as diverse as contact tracing to delivering basic necessities, raising awareness, online education, and promoting commerce. Definitely, India will come out an even stronger digital power with the attendant consequences to the global knowledge economy. Now, what does all of this mean to contemporary geopolitics? To start with, it will shape the nature and terms of India's engagement with major economies like China, US, EU, Japan, ASEAN, etc. 2, the practices that India perfects at home become exportable abroad. They too will play out, obviously, differently in different geographies. 3, greater global conversations on resilient supply chains could play to India's advantage. Some of these are ongoing G2G exercises, others would be discussions with business. 4, India's own thinking about deeper global economic engagement with the world will be influenced both by the geopolitical divides and the pandemic pressures. There was already a reassessment of FTA experiences, keeping in mind the damaging impact they've had on India's manufacturing. The attention could now well shift to becoming part of a global value chains rather than entering into more formal trading arrangements. This would be so especially as making it easier to do business gains further traction. We are conscious of the need not just to improve on our own record, but to become competitive vis-a-vis the world. So let me conclude by returning to the theme of my remarks. We are heading for a more fractured and complicated world, one with greater multipolarity and less multilateralism. In all this change, the opportunities are certainly there. Seizing them will be the real test of our mettle. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Jaishankar. Multipolarities indeed, and the metrics of measuring power. At Bloomberg, we understand metrics very well, and of course, we will continue this conversation with Ruth Pollard, Team Leader for South and Southeast Asian Government Coverage. But first, a reminder to our audience. If you have any questions for Minister Jaishankar, please submit them via the Questions tab on the left side of your screen. I repeat, on the left side of your screen, you'll find the Questions tab, and Minister Jaishankar can receive your questions. If you wish to tweet from this event, please include the hashtag Bloomberg India. Now over to you, Ruth, for your conversation with Minister Jaishankar.
Thank you, Jeanette, and welcome again, Minister. We very much appreciate your time this evening. It's been described by, I think, both the US and Indian government officials as the elephant in the room, China. And I think that is what our audience will be most looking forward to hearing from you on tonight. So the presence of Chinese troops on India's borders has been one of the biggest concerns in these last few months. And it's been several weeks since you and your Chinese counterpart met in Moscow. Are you happy with the way that that agreement has been implemented so far?
Well, just for the record, I think the elephant in the room remark was an American remark. But anyway, put that aside. Where discussions with the Chinese are concerned, yes, I met my counterpart in Moscow on the sidelines of the SCO Foreign Ministers meeting. We had a discussion and we agreed on the importance of early disengagement. And since then, there have been meetings on site, so to speak, between the military commanders assisted by diplomats. That is work in progress. So at this moment, I really don't have more of a readout.
Well, like you say, there's been several rounds of talks, both diplomatically and with the senior military leaders. And yet we're still seeing lots of Chinese troops and increased hardware at the border, and that's despite the oncoming winter. Do you think India will have to ensure a permanent army presence along the line of control with China, given the current signs? And if so, what are the chances that this might escalate into war?
No, look, I think, first of all, we regularly patrol the line of actual control. So, it's not a question of having a permanent or a temporary army presence. The army is there all the time and the army is constantly monitoring and patrolling. But as I said, look, the discussions are going on. It's work in progress. And the first rule of my business is don't predict what is still going on. And I really think you can ask me this question in multiple ways, you're still going to get the same answer.
So you're not concerned about a winter deployment, which, as I understand, would be an unusual thing to have this increased troop presence in a permanent state along those extra mountaintops that India has seized in these most recent weeks?
No, again, look, as I said, we can keep going round and round on this. At this moment, discussions are going on. What is going on obviously is something confidential between us and the Chinese. And we will wait to see how this plays out. Now, where this would go, a hypothetical, speculative answer, first of all, I wouldn't give it. And whatever is my thinking at this time, obviously, I will keep it to myself.
Of course.
That was your thought,
Before we go to our next question, let's go to the audience with our next polling question. What do you see as the main foreign policy challenge facing India today? The China tensions that we've just been talking about, Pakistan, or the US-China trade dispute, which affects India and its ambitions to take a bigger slice of the global supply chain. So we'll just wait for some audience voting to come in, and obviously I'm not the only one who's interested in hearing the answers on China, Minister. People are very concerned about what's happening along your line of actual control along that border. Okay, so so I think we can safely conclude that China is the thing on most people's minds right now. So we will go to the next question. India has given shelter to the Dalai Lama.
Do you mind if I react to that? Do you mind if I react to that?
Please do. Please go ahead.
Okay. Look, don't get me wrong. I didn't say I was not concerned about what was happening on our borders with China. What I said was, this is an ongoing discussion, negotiation, call it what you would. And there isn't very much that I'm in a position to say in public, and I certainly don't want to prejudge it. But when I looked at the options that were posed, to me, they were partly tactical. Yes, I'm not minimizing the seriousness of the situation on the borders with China. After all, after 45 years, we've had military casualties on that border. And there is a troop build-up, which in many ways has no precedent in recent past. So the gravity of it is certainly there, which is why I saw the numbers out there in that bar graph which you put up. But what I would say is, rather than say the biggest challenge tensions with China, tensions with Pakistan or US-China, in a sense, these are tactical issues. I mean, they are expressions of larger structural challenges that we face. I would, in fact, put it slightly differently, and I tried to do that in my remarks as well, which is, for me, the China issue is really, can a rising China and a rising India find an equilibrium? And what you are seeing in the borders is today an expression of that, that challenge, of the inability to meet that challenge. The Pakistan issue, of course, is an issue, but again, it is bigger than a tensions issue. I mean, there has been, for decades now, cross-border terrorism by Pakistan. So there's a underlying issue of really, what is Pakistan about? How does it see India? Is in this day and age, is the use of terrorism as a instrument of statecraft legitimate and permissible? And when it comes to the US-China issue, I think I've said in my remarks that I see that as the big sort of overarching context. And the fact that it is harder to find common ground today makes it much more difficult to conduct diplomacy. So in a sense, you have my vote on all of them. Clearly, there are priorities out there, but they're all reflections of this larger, geopolitical complexity and how India is trying to deal with it.
Yes, that's true. And I think it goes to my next question as well. When you speak about, long-lasting geopolitical concerns. India has given shelter to the Dalai Lama since the 1950s. And these recent clashes that we saw along the border with China had a Tibetan soldier die in that fighting. Now, commentators in Beijing are very worried that India will seek to destabilise Tibet as part of this border conflict with China. But what's your response to that?
Well, look, I think, I see no relationship between the various issues or, points that you mentioned. What is the problem today with China on our borders? The problem with China on our borders is that for the last 30 years, more, we have built a relationship, we have expanded our cooperation, predicated on peace and tranquility along the border. Okay, in the 1980s, for example, we had virtually no trade with China, but because we had a series of agreements beginning with 1993, which sort of provided the basis for peace and tranquility on the borders, other forms of cooperation were built up. Now, if that underlying peace and tranquility is disturbed, if the agreements which the two sides signed are not honored, then clearly that is the primary cause of the disruption. So I don't think we should get into other issues which frankly have nothing to do with the situation currently in Ladakh.
Okay, look, moving on to a trade question now. In your recent book, you say the border and the future of ties cannot be separated. And we've seen India lead with restrictions on China, particularly via bans on apps like TikTok, over concerns about data security and reining in the influence of Chinese companies. Now, to what extent can India reduce its economic dependence on China? And is that an explicit goal with these options?
Well, look, I think, as I said, the basis for more cooperation, we've had more trade, investments, there are different common forms of societal cooperation as well. All of this was predicated on peace and tranquility on the border. So my concern is that for many of us who have seen this relationship grow, if you disturb its foundation, so to speak, then you cannot be impervious to the fact that it will have consequences. Yeah, I mean, it's nobody's desire to have those consequences, but that problem, in a sense, was not created on our side. So I would say that as a broad cooperative trend, the early restoration of peace and tranquility is good for everybody. But let's come to the issue of trade and economic dealings with each other. I think that's had its own problems. I mean, these are not new problems. I remember, I was ambassador in China beginning, from the middle of 2009. Even in 2009, which is more than a decade ago, we were concerned about lack of market access in China, about, the non-reciprocal nature of trade, about the mounting trade deficit, which to our mind was not a natural outcome of our comparative advantages. And we would, the examples which were often cited were, say, IT services or pharmaceuticals, where we've been, I would say, pretty much universally present, and our competitive capabilities are not in doubt. But in the Chinese market, we were not able to make a dent at all. So the trade issue, in fact, has been going. It's been a very difficult conversation for more than a decade now. Not just a difficult conversation, it has gone all the way out. Our leaders have discussed it at the summits, and both recognized that this is a very unsatisfactory situation and something needs to be done about it. So far nothing practical has been done about it as yet. So in a sense, you have two, I would say, independent or at least autonomous issues out here. One, the fact that the basis of cooperation has got disturbed by the disturbance to peace and tranquility in the border areas, and the other that there are sort of structural problems in India-China trade, and these have been coming, it's not something which can be papered over anymore. I mean, if you look at our trade deficit with China, I mean, the graphs like that. So people, even before the current happenings on the border, have felt that was not sustainable.
But I mean, to what extent can India reduce its economic dependence on China? You know, what's within your control?
Well, look, again, I would shift in a sense to a larger point, which I made right at the end of my remarks, which is to look at our trading arrangements and ask ourselves how well they worked for us. My own sense is that in the last decade, last 2 decades perhaps, Indian manufacturing has been very negatively impacted by many of our trade arrangements, and it's something which we seriously need to look at. So, what is happening today in India is actually a determination to rebuild our economy, to see that the kind of support our manufacturing, encouragement our manufacturing should get is given, and that that other countries don't take advantage of our openness and use what works for them, including non-market means to sort of gain an edge over us at home. So I think these are issues of sort of assessing the pluses and minuses of our trading arrangements, and China is a very big part of it because our biggest deficit is with China. But in a way, I would suggest to you it's actually a bigger issue.
Well, in this case, the US has been very supportive of India through this border crisis with China. And certainly the two nations have become much closer over the past few years, particularly on defence and security ties. So how would you characterise India's relationship with the US, and to what extent can you improve it further, particularly in the defence security area with Washington?
Well, again, your question sort of suggests an immediacy to this relationship. I think the facts would show that this has actually been a 20-year trend. I think most people would agree that if you were to look at inflection points, one big inflection point was President Clinton's visit to India when Prime Minister Vajpayee was in power. The nuclear deal was another big inflection point. Probably Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2014 was another one. So it's been, I say this about the India-US relations. If you look at the American end, you have 4 presidents: Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. I can't think of 4 more different individuals, and yet all of them, and with 4 very different policies. Okay. Yet all of them have been remarkably consistent in the priority that they've given to our relationship. Similarly, look at the Indian end. You've actually had, during this period, Prime Minister Vajpayee, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and now Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Again, you see a very sort of strong continuity. In fact, not just continuity; it's the relationship has actually steadily grown. So, I would propose to you really that this is something structural, that there's a very deep convergence today between India and the United States. And while, yes, defense and security is a very important element of the relationship, there are strengths which actually predated that. If you look at the societal contact, in fact, today, if I were to look at all our foreign policy relationships, this is the one which is most people driven. The fact that we have, I think, about maybe roughly 4 million Indian American citizens, many more temporary residents of the United States, so many students out there. The breadth of this relationship, it's really quite extraordinary. If you look at the trade side, the technology side, the education side, these are real strengths of the relationship. So while I know that defense and security tends to get the headlines, I would actually say one shouldn't, neglect what have been the real drivers of this relationship, because the defense relationship is actually in the current phase roughly about 10 years old, maybe a little more.
Have you got as much as you had hoped to get out of that defence relationship, though, in the last 10 years? I mean, there's a lot of items still on India's shopping list that it would like to have in its kit, particularly with this border dispute with China that you don't yet have from the US. How do you push that forward?
I don't know. I have double discomfort here. One, you reduce a relationship to the defense side, and then you reduce defense to shopping. So I'm not against shopping, okay, but I think it's a far more complicated reality out there than your question would suggest. My sense is, and again, you're linking it to a very sort of immediate happening. That is, as I said, the record shows that is not the case. Our defense relationship were pretty much at the equipment level, pretty much frozen from the mid 60s for about 40 years or so. So they started really picking up about 15 years ago. And you have to ask yourself why. It wasn't, it reflected actually the changing world, the fact that India and the United States no longer felt that their interests were, clashing with each other. And defense is a pretty sensitive area, so you need a fair degree of comfort and confidence if you are, using each other's equipment. So it reflects a political convergence out there. So I would say look at the trends rather than reduce the matter to have a shopping list and how much of your shopping list did you get done.
Moving on to the US election, polls are showing that US President Donald Trump is down by double digits to Joe Biden. Are you worried that this progression that you've talked about of warming ties between the US and India through 4 different presidents or 4 different administrations, are you concerned that that might change under a Biden-Harris White House? And if so, could you explain some of those concerns?
Well, look, again, the point I was making was that the record over the last 20 plus years bears out the fact that this is a relationship which is deeper than the administration of the day, whichever administration of the day. Okay, it has spanned multiple administrations at both ends. By the way, it's not just an administration to government relationship. We are a relationship which has traditionally enjoyed both bipartisan and, in a sense, non-partisan support in the United States. If typically, whether you want to measure it by, say, India caucus or occasions like, addresses to the Congress, etc., you can see leaders on both sides of the argument come together in support of the relationship. Usually, whether it's visitors we receive or when we go out, that is evident as well. So I'm very confident in the fundamental strengths of this relationship. And in democratic societies, elections are part of life. Really democratic people, small d democratic people, don't worry about elections. They happen, they move on. You sort of, deal with the realities which elections produce.
Sure. Let's move on and look at one of the other dominant issues right now, which, of course, as you've noted, is the coronavirus pandemic. Now, your ministry has announced plans to ensure supplies of COVID vaccines to neighbouring countries once it's available. Could you tell us more about India's plans and the discussion around sourcing and distribution of a vaccine?
Okay. Well, actually, when the Prime Minister spoke to this time we had a virtual UN General Assembly, he mentioned there as well that, India would contribute its vaccine production capacity for global benefit. And the thinking that we are bringing to bear is in line with what we did during the pandemic. In the last few months, there was an enormous global demand on us for medicines which were specific to to COVID-19, particularly hydroxychloroquine and paracetamol. And we've actually ramped up capacities. We supplied medicines to 150 countries, and we actually ensured that a lot of countries who would have struggled otherwise to get them for financial or logistical reasons, we would sort of go out of our way to provide them with those medicines. So it's part of a mindset. I mean, we feel we can make a difference to the world by doing what we can. Again, we have a history of really, in a sense, a history of, I would say, internationalism, but also a history of solidarity with countries, with whom, to some degree, we have shared past. So I think that's a mindset which will operate also when we get into the vaccine production and distribution stage. Now, my understanding of where we are is that at this time, there are 3 separate sets of clinical trials which are going on in India. 2 of them relate to Indian vaccines, and these are, I think, at stage 2. The third one relates to the one which Serum Institute is doing with AstraZeneca, and I think that's at stage 3. Now, when these vaccines will come on stream, etc. I mean, that's really not my expertise. But we've also been involved in international initiatives, including COVAX, so that sensitivity that it must be available to everybody, it should be accessible, affordable. That sensitivity is very much there, and certainly many of our immediate neighbors have raised that issue with us, and we have obviously sought to reassure them. So our intent is to be globally contributive. I think that is in line with our record during the Corona period, and like everybody else, I mean, I'm also hoping that the sooner we get the vaccine, the better we are.
Yes, we're all hoping for that. Let's move on now to the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. You've been instrumental in your role as Foreign Minister in building up the Quad relationship. What's India's main priorities? Where do you see the Quad going next? And how do you see cooperation between the Quad nations expanding?
Well, in a sense, let me tell you what Quad is about. I think you heard me use the word multipolarity in my remarks. Okay. Which in plain English means that there are many more powers who can make a difference or shape the outcome on a particular issue. Now, in the old days meaning, say, post-Second World War days till the 1980s, you had a sort of the Cold War. You had 2 camps. You had non-aligned countries. That was the broad landscape. Okay. Then after that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you had what was, for want of a better term, called a unipolar world, which basically meant the dominance of the United States. And a lot of countries sought, where they differed with the United States, to protect their interests at that time. And again, in diplomacy, the word which was used at that time was strategic autonomy. Now, right now, what you have is a dispersal of power. Okay, depending on the issue, different different countries have converging interests. Now, it's not going to be easy to find an issue where you agree with somebody else fully. It's not going to be easy to find an issue where everybody agrees on that issue. So you're going to have this, a world of partial agreements, if you would, or issue-based groupings. Now, in the case of Quad, what has happened is 4 countries who feel that on many issues like maritime security, connectivity, counterterrorism, they felt that it was useful to have consultations and meet on a more regular basis. It began at an official level. It's now, from last year, it actually became at a foreign minister's level. So that has happened the second time in Tokyo early in October. And I think the sense is, okay, it's useful, it works for everybody, we all get benefit out of it. So let's do it regularly. So that's really where it is. So it's a kind of I would say, a diplomatic consultation, understanding between 4 countries. Now, it's not unique. I mean, if you look at it, BRICS is also a plurilateral gathering of countries, spread in multiple continents, who felt that their interests would be better served by working together. And there were a certain set of issues where they decided they would work together. Within Eurasia, we have a subset of the BRICS. It's called RIC, Russia, India, China. Now, these have been practices going on for many years. I mean, it has been going on for almost 20 years now. BRICS has also been there for more than a decade now. So sometimes, there are I'd say arrangements or agreements which are more formal. Like we had one with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They had their sets of issues, their sets of players, their own scheduling, etc. Sometimes it's more informal, sometimes it's somewhere in between. So, but this is today the new world that we have entered into. So I think people who have a forward-looking perspective, who truly appreciate multipolarity, they should understand and appreciate, Quad, even if they are not members of Quad. I mean, they should say, yes, this is a changing world, and it's natural that countries would come together. And this is not the only example of countries coming together. So, I think the problems happen if you have a sort of older mindset, and then it sort of becomes us versus them. I don't think that's really how, at least I see the future.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We'll now go to our audience question session. We've got a little bit of time left. First up, we have a question from Akhil Berry, who's from the Eurasia Group. He's asking, India is set to receive the S-400 missile defense system from Russia next year, which would trigger those CATSA sanctions from the US unless you're granted a waiver. How concerned are you about the potential for sanctions?
Look, again, India has a long history of defense and security with the Soviet Union and with Russia. It's an older history than we have with the United States, at least in the current phase. So the basis today for, countries dealing with each other is that, we have our interests, our partners have their interests, and you work out how that works. I don't think international relations should be run, and I'm not necessarily talking of this particular example, I would make it a wider proposition. It doesn't work if, one partner says, well, I have these are my views and this alone will prevail. So there's a lot of give and take in diplomacy, and I see no reason why that give and take should not work out.
Okay, one question here we have from Michael Kugelman from the Wilson Center in Washington. What are India's top goals in its relationship with the US right now, and how does it plan to pursue them?
Look, it would vary because it's, again, the American relationship is such a broad relationship today. I mean, you would have political goals, you would have defense and security goals, there would be trade goals, there would be issues regarding, movement of talent, technology issues. So it's really a very, very broad-based relationship, I would say, and a relationship with growing ambition. So I'm very confident. I've been associated with that relationship off and on almost now for 40 years, and I've seen it really change remarkably for the better. So I do think that given the potential of the relationship, it's important to have the right degree of ambition, to set out, sort of goals commensurate to our vision of that, and really have the confidence to pursue them, and not, necessarily get distracted by the sort of problems of the day. I'm not saying those are unimportant. I mean, in diplomacy, the daily grind is as important as it is in business. But I think it's important to have a sort of a larger strategic view while working it on a daily basis. And given the track record of the last 20 years, I remain very optimistic about this relationship, as I do about most other relationships, by the way. But this one, particularly, I think the record bears out that it is something of considerable potential.
Thank you. And we'll go to a question now from Raki Prasad from Alder Capital. How can India use its strength and improve its exports with key trading partners, and which sectors are we trying to focus on?
Part of the thinking of what I spoke to you about, Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, was really to build the strengths within the country which would make us a more effective player abroad, and a lot of those are economic strengths. Now, we have seen in the last 2 decades that to a large extent our manufacturing took a hit due to sort of cheap alternatives coming, which really came because they were produced in a very, very different environment. But what you have, what you are seeing in India today is really, in a sense, a much more broad-based, deeper reform, which the country has long awaited. So it is very likely today, say, if you take agriculture, where recent reforms in agriculture have really freed up the space for much more competitive, sort of productive agriculture, that you will see India much more active in that space. I think if we are fair to our industry and give them a truly level playing field, I'm very confident that you will actually see a lot of our manufacturing exports grow as well. And there's been, particularly in the last 6 years, a very determined effort to make it easier to actually sit down with business and figure out their problems and respond to that. And you can see that. You can see that in growing FDI numbers. You can see that. I mean, it's interesting. Even in this lockdown period, I think people have seen how they have handled a period of great stress. And my sense, even if I say so myself, is I think the world has much more confidence today in India. And that is reflected in new businesses setting up shop, in India. So I see actually far more, making India production a part of their. I see much more Indian exports outside. Definitely, as I said, on the digital front, we are a much stronger part. And since today trust is an important part of supply chains, I think that quest for more resilient and more trusted supply brings more business into it.
Thank you, Minister. And I think we have time for one more question from Vetri Subramaniam from UTI Asset Management. What are the economic priorities of our foreign policy?
I think the economic priorities, there are the obvious ones, okay? Today, there isn't a country in the world which doesn't put promotion of trade right up there. But in the case of India, we have looked at the world not just as a global market, but also as a global workplace. So one part of it is the obvious ones, which everybody does, push your trade interests where there are investment interests, that's there. There's a lot of attention being given to mobility issues, to the demands of knowledge economy and the movement of talent. But there is a third issue, and that is a realization today that there are resources, technologies, best practices in the world which can facilitate our own modernization at home. We see that, you'll be aware there are a lot of these national campaigns, campaigns of, smart city programs, cleaning up the rivers program, even issues like railway modernization. So some of it is, a lot of it is outwards, but increasingly, as we get meshed more and more with the world, a lot of it is also making that connect with the outer world to see whether, how to strengthen the domestic economy.
Great. Thank you very much, Minister. That was the last question, and we appreciate you spending your time with us this evening. Back to you, Jeanette.
Thank you once again, Minister Jaishankar, and thank you, Ruth.